To begin the event, I would like to invite Professor Danny Kwa, Dean and Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy on stage to give his welcome remarks and introduction. Dean, please.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends, both in this room and coming in online, whether by the Zoom platform or on Facebook. Good evening. Many of you will not have seen my face in a long time since we've all been masked. But again, my name is Danny Kwa, and I am Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics and Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this event, the Hong Xiu Ching Lecture, organized by the Center on Asia and Globalization, what we fondly know as CAG, at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And this evening, we are honored and delighted that this evening's Hong Xiu Ching Lecture will be delivered by Dr. Marty Natalegawa. Before I more fully introduce Dr. Marty, let me lay out the sequence of events this evening. Dr. Marty has said that he will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we will have a question and answer session. Those of you who are here with us physically in this room, please indicate your intention to me or to our Lee Kuan Yew School helpers around the room, and we will get you a microphone. At the same time, I know that the people who have zoomed in online or are watching on Facebook would also like to ask questions. So those of you who are online, if you could key in your questions either in the Q&A box on Zoom or in the appropriate chat function on Facebook, I will then get to as many of you as I can. This entire event will end at 6:30 Singapore time. At CAG, our Center on Asia and Globalization, the Hong Xiu Ching Lecture series is funded by a gift from Mr. Tay Liam Wee, former CEO and Group Managing Director, Sincere Watch. He has done this in honor of his late mother, Ms. Hong Xiu Ching. The center and the school are both deeply grateful to Mr. Tay for his generosity. The Center on Asia and Globalization is one of the Lee Kuan Yew School's research centers. CAG undertakes academic research and policy outreach on globalization, as the name suggests, and on world and regional order. The center's research covers, among other things, great power relations, the rise of Asia, East Asia's regional politics and diplomatic relations, and the drivers and consequences of globalization. The center organizes Track 2 dialogues, convenes expert discussion with practitioners and academics both, and publishes the widely read China-India Brief. The list of past Hong Xiu Ching lectures is a distinguished one, and this evening continues that arc. Pak Marty, of course, served as Indonesia's foreign minister from 2009 through 2014. Before then, he had been Indonesia's permanent representative and ambassador to the United Nations, and prior to that, ambassador in the UK and Ireland. Within ASEAN, he has been one of the region's key leaders, driving the community through the Bali Concords, pressing for peaceful dispute settlement, and the repudiation of use of force among the members of the East Asia Summit. Pak Marty was president of the UN Security Council in 2007 and chaired the working group on peacekeeping operations and the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. He was a key voice to help secure Indonesia's 2012 ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Pak Marty has received the highest awards for service to his home nation. And in addition, in 2012, he was made Honorary Knight Commander by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. A not uncommon view in this part of the world and more broadly places Pak Marty as one of the most respected foreign policy and international security thinkers of his generation across the entire Asia-Pacific region. So again, we are honored and delighted to have Pak Marty with us this evening to deliver his Hong Xiu Ching lecture, Securing Peace in the Indo-Pacific in an Age of Geopolitical Shifts. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Marty Natalegawa to the podium?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for your very kind introduction. But most of all, I'd like to begin by thanking the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the Center for its invitation to me to speak at this Ho Xiu Ching lecture on the theme of securing peace in the Indo-Pacific in an age of geopolitical shifts. I'm especially grateful to those who are not only following online, but who are present with us all here in this room. And I wish especially to acknowledge the Ambassador of Indonesia as well, who's with us earlier, whom I had greeted earlier. Dear friends and colleagues, the age of geopolitics is well and truly back in the Indo-Pacific. An increasingly familiar narrative is often detailed of the ever-intensifying US-China rivalries, each seeing in the other as a competitor, a rival, and even an adversary, of the ever-widening fields in which such rivalries are being played out, beyond the traditional military and security domains, into the economy, trade, finance, technology, including cyberspace and even public health, of the reawakening of long-known regional hotspots where open conflicts, intended or unintended, may break, of the return of security, defense, and military alliances and partnerships as responses to maintain a so-called balance of power in the region, of headwinds against diplomacy, formal and informal, as means to manage potentials for conflict, of the fragility of cooperation on global common issues that demand cooperative partnership, health and climate, to cite a few. Indeed, while attention seems focused on the US-China rivalry, both its various manifestations and potential ramifications, it is well to recognize of other bilateral and regional geopolitical dynamics whose trajectories may also have significant implications on the Indo-Pacific's present and future. The increasingly competitive China-India ties, marked not only by the long unresolved land border issues, rather one that is now also being increasingly manifested in the Indian Ocean's maritime domain. The not-to-be-neglected US-China relations, two of the world's heaviest nuclear weapon-armed states, with the attendant capacity to severely impact the region's peace and security. The repercussions of China-Russia relations, whether predominantly imbued by a spirit of partnership, as in recent years, as they encounter a perceived common competitor, perhaps, in the United States, or whether of potential future schisms as divergent interests surface. The complex and volatile web of geopolitical dynamics that is Northeast Asia, the ever-vacillating Korean Peninsula dynamics, with an unpredictable DPRK at its center, and the uncertain China-Japan, China-ROK, Japan-Russia, Japan-ROK ties in a sub-region devoid of any meaningful regional cooperative framework. Further, there is no shortage of issues upon which all these complex geopolitical dynamics may be superimposed. For instance, the competing claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the risk-prone cross-strait dynamic, the powder keg that is the Korean Peninsula, the land border disputes between India and China, and further afield between India and Pakistan, the emergence of the Southwest Pacific as a contested geopolitical space with China's increasing assertiveness and Australia's recent unambiguous tilt towards the United States, and an increased attention to the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea as key lifelines of global commerce between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And, not to be ignored, the prevalence of complex internal situations with potential for region-wide repercussions, upon which divergent geopolitical interests may be projected. The current situation in Myanmar being the most recent of example. Given their potential ramifications, how are countries of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN, to respond to these geopolitical shifts? How can ASEAN proceed beyond simply describing these situations and alternatively expressing concern over them and hoping that somehow the geopolitical tensions may be ameliorated? Is there more that countries of ASEAN can do other than appealing for restraint, expressing preference not to be forced to choose sides, and reciting the often expressed ASEAN centrality? Perhaps before I proceed, I need to address a salient school of thought within the region which holds that expectation of ASEAN should be tempered, that ASEAN should not be tasked with responsibilities that are not for it to shoulder to begin with, namely the management of the region's geopolitical common. Certainly, the broad spectrum or differences in foreign policy orientation of ASEAN member states, devoid of uniformity, adds weight to this view. In essence, suggesting that it would be unrealistic to expect more from ASEAN than the type of broad appeals for restraint that it has recently made, and that the best and most realistic course of action for ASEAN would simply be to avoid being drawn in to the current geopolitical vortex. These are certainly legitimate views. However, as a matter of fact, the variation in ASEAN member states' foreign policy orientations, some align to different extra-regional powers, others professing independent orientation, has not in the past precluded ASEAN from projecting a measure of common external outlook and policies in the interests of the region as a whole. While ASEAN has purposefully avoided from interjecting in the foreign policy orientation of its member states, at the same time it has managed to strike a common approach on how extra-regional states should interact with the region and, though perhaps less successfully, how they should interact with one another in the region. ASEAN's very founding document, the 1967 Bangkok Declaration, did not shy away in stipulating the newly formed association's views on the wider region's geopolitics, referring to the temporary nature of foreign military bases, for instance. Indeed, ever since, we have been witness to a steady evolution of ASEAN's external outlook and ambitions even, from neutrality, emphasis on resilience, and later, centrality, as seminal ASEAN declarations and treaties such as ZOFAN, the TAC, SHONFIS, the ASEAN Charter, the 3 Bali Concords, and the 2011 East Asia Summit Bali Principles, as well as processes such as the ASEAN Plus with dialogue partners, ASEAN Plus 3, the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, and RCEP, all of them attest to ASEAN's confidence in not only being engaged actively in the discourse of the region's peace and security, rather also in taking thought and policy leadership, giving substance as well as concrete meaning to the notion of ASEAN centrality. ASEAN-initiated regional security architectures often became the only platforms where extra-regional states, otherwise disengaged from one another, can exchange views, and sometimes in the most robust of manner, on regional issues of common concern. And significantly, more than mere convening power, ASEAN projected thought leadership by offering norms and principles guiding states' conduct in the region. Nowhere is this more apparent than the ever-increasing numbers of countries acceding to the 1976 Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. By traditional indices of power, perhaps one is more often reminded of ASEAN's limitations, certainly compared to the other countries in its surround. Also, given the reality of the varying foreign policy orientation of ASEAN member states, it would not be unnatural to succumb to the notion that a common external approach is beyond ASEAN. However, ASEAN's past of earned centrality reminded of one quality that ASEAN possesses in great abundance that others lack, namely the confidence and trust, or in ASEAN parlance, comfort level other countries have in the past of ASEAN's capacity and impartiality to provide the wherewithal for the effective management of the regional commons, namely its security and stability in the interests of all. Moreover, the variation in ASEAN member states' foreign policy orientations have not always been a recipe for divisions or inaction in the face of extra-regional states' rivalries. Rather, as an asset to ASEAN, giving it the capacity to develop a multi-pronged relationship with extra-regional powers with varying interests. And not least of all, despite the differing foreign policy orientations of ASEAN member states, they have all shared a common and overriding interest in safeguarding the region's peace and stability that have been prerequisites to its prosperity. I thought it relevant to recall such past ASEAN constructive activism and the unique qualities that ASEAN possesses to dispel any sense of resignation in the face of recent challenging geopolitical environment. Self-doubts about ASEAN's capacity to effect change might actually self-fulfill to render an ineffective ASEAN. A passive ASEAN, silent and inactive, and at best reactive in the face of a region marked by constant geopolitical shifts and change, risks an organization consigned to irrelevance and being adrift. Worse still, it may portend a divided ASEAN as one by one ASEAN member states are picked out by contending extra-regional powers to join their ranks, leaving the region as divided as it once was. And lest there be some doubts, given the indivisibility of peace linking the various sub-regions, today epitomized by the term Indo-Pacific, ASEAN cannot afford to maintain an exclusively Southeast Asia focus. Peace in our region and the precious peace dividend we have all enjoyed as a result cannot be secured in isolation from the wider regions. In short, our past and our future instruct that ASEAN respond proactively and urgently to the geopolitical challenges and opportunities before it. There really is no opting out option. At the risk of oversimplification and in the face of current renewed geopolitical challenges, I believe it important that ASEAN provides two-level types of responses, conceptual and policies, each reinforcing the other. Of the first, I would consider it important for ASEAN to offer an alternative and its own perspective on the management of geopolitical shifts that is fit for the contemporary age and the future as well. A perspective that secures and consolidates the relevance of the countries of ASEAN in the wider region's affairs. To offer an alternative, for instance, to the often cited notion of balance of power that relies on a stratified idea of power among states and has instead arguably been a recipe for the search for preponderance of power by some over the other, providing a catalyst for a chain of action-reaction leading to greater risk of miscalculation. Instead, to recognize perhaps that geopolitical shifts and change are permanent features, and that therefore it may be more pertinent to speak of dynamics of power rather than balance of power, where deciphering states' intent through intensified diplomacy becomes as equally important as analyzing their military potential. To offer alternative, for instance, to the notion of security that has innate focus on military capacities and significantly is far too often seen as one to be secured at the expense of the other, providing trigger for regional arms race and yet ending up with less sense of security all around. To speak instead of common security, one anchored on recognition that to be sustained and to be stable, security is a public good to be enjoyed by all states. To reject old age maxim, might is right, and insert instead the sovereign equality of states, large and small. To recognize as well that in this 21st century, threats to human security takes non-traditional form. The current pandemic and climate change challenge, for instance, that defy national solutions alone and demand cooperative partnership among states, comprehensive security. And to offer an alternative to increasingly tiresome debate between proponents of various so-called international order, which are often viewed with suspicion by the contending parties. Instead, to refer to the common interest states in the region share without prejudice to the strongly held position they have on specific dispute situations to promote predictability of states' conduct and behavior aimed at avoiding miscalculation and unintended conflict. In years past, I used the term dynamic equilibrium to describe such an alternative perspective and state of affairs. Inherent within it is a recognition of the constantly changing nature of power dynamics in the region and the futility of attempts at freeze-framing a particular power constellation as it would falsely set states into two camps or two categories, those in favor of retaining the status quo and those determined to revise it and set off a self-fulfilling competitive dynamic between them. At the same time, the term equilibrium offers acknowledgement that amidst such constantly changing and evolving power dynamic, some degree of stability and predictability of states' behavior are still much needed. Agreed norms and principles of states' conduct, anchored on the notion of comprehensive and common security, would guard against an anarchical state of affairs in our region. However, a perspective such as this, or others for that matter that ASEAN may rally around, must find manifestation in concrete and relevant steps. The former reminds that ASEAN's efforts cannot pause as a mere outlook. The latter reminds that ASEAN's efforts must be responsive to actual prevailing challenges. Any paucity in ASEAN's timely and relevant response to the region's perceived challenges guarantees that others would take the mantle. The Quad, the AUKUS, intensified China-Russia security cooperation, provided only the most recent of examples. This leads me to the second of the two-level types of response I cited earlier, namely specific policies. While the Indo-Pacific is replete with challenges, on this occasion I merely wish to cite two that in my view are deserving of attention and concrete policy response by ASEAN. First, the ever-deepening trust deficit among states of the region. Second, the prevalence of case situations where a relatively minor incident could escalate into major crisis, and even as a result of miscalculation and a chain of action-reaction to unintended conflict. The renewed trust deficit among key states of the region, cited earlier, have occurred despite decades-long confidence and trust-building efforts by ASEAN. ASEAN-initiated regional processes, including the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Dialogue Partner Relations, ASEAN +3, East Asia Summit, ADMM+, expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, and ASEAN plus China efforts on the South China Sea, have certainly played a critical part in providing the wherewithal for establishing communications and habit of cooperation even when none existed before. They have also played a key roles in facilitating the region's transition at the end of the Cold War. However, it must be said, as these processes acquire more regular and routine character, each with its own well-charted plans of actions and programs, it is difficult to avoid the impression that they have become increasingly disconnected from actual developments on the ground. And here the South China Sea comes to mind. Or from the increasingly tense geopolitical ties in the region, for instance, the China-US divisions. The routine annual meeting of the East Asia Summit, purposefully encompassing the key states of the Indo-Pacific rather than simply East Asia, and deliberately described as being leaders-led forum, struggles to earn relevance in the face of fast-changing geopolitical dynamic and deepening trust deficit. In my humble opinion, ASEAN must empower and utilize the various modalities and processes it has initiated in the past decades that were, after all, designed precisely in anticipation of renewed geopolitical rivalries. More specifically, to address the present trust deficit, the time is ripe for ASEAN to push for a renewed highest level commitment by states of the Indo-Pacific to the region's peace and security, notwithstanding the real and genuine differences that they have. For leaders of states of the Indo-Pacific to take personal charge of the management of the region's commons and place diplomacy at the forefront. ASEAN has a potential role to play in extrapolating its own experience. The 1976 TAC setting aside the use of force in settling disputes among signatory countries of Southeast Asia, preferring instead the path of dialogue and diplomacy, has been transformational in gradually ushering strategic trust amongst countries of Southeast Asia and ridding of the trust deficit previously prevalent. I believe it important for ASEAN to push for similar reaffirmation, again, at the highest level of the peaceful intent of states in the Indo-Pacific. Essentially, however complex and however intractable some of the disputes and differences between countries of the Indo-Pacific, they are fundamentally committed to their peaceful management or settlement. ASEAN already possesses some promising bases. The earlier mentioned TAC has been exceeded by a significant number of key states in the Indo-Pacific. Speaking only of the past, for Indonesia, this situation did not come about by accident. Convinced of the need to broaden the TAC principles to the wider region, Indonesia insisted, for instance, that accession to the TAC is set as one of the preconditions for participation in the East Asia Summit. As a result, ASEAN witnessed a positive competitive dynamic with countries readily acceding to the TAC as they seek participation in the East Asia Summit. Further, and not without considerable thought, as chair of ASEAN in 2011, Indonesia initiated an effort that resulted in the adoption by the leaders of the East Asia Summit of the 2011 Declaration of East Asia Summit on the Principles for Mutually Beneficial Relations, or the East Asia Summit Bali Principles. Notably, among the 12 principles cited were renunciation of the use of the threat of force or use of force against another state, consistent with the UN Charter, and settlement of differences and disputes by peaceful means. Indonesia's goal at the time was clear: to apply a TAC-like commitment, this time not only between countries of Southeast Asia, rather also between countries of the East Asia Summit as a whole, to project to the wider region ASEAN's own transformative experience in converting trust deficit to strategic trust. In this connection, I believe it timely for ASEAN to renew the East Asia Summit Bali Principles commitment, and more significantly still, to elevate it to a binding commitment in the form of a possible East Asia Summit Treaty for Friendship and Cooperation. While a treaty-level commitment may be the ultimate objective, ASEAN may perhaps initially choose to rally the countries of the East Asia Summit around their already made commitment to the peaceful settlement of disputes. I believe that a renewed highest-level political reaffirmation of peaceful intent would be invaluable in arresting the current ever-deepening trust deficit among the states of the Indo-Pacific. There cannot be business as usual in the face of the ever-deepening geopolitical divides in the Indo-Pacific. Second, the risk of miscalculation, the misreading of intent, leading to unintended conflict in the Indo-Pacific, also deserves attention. The risks have certainly heightened. The prevalence of scenarios involving possibility of nuclear weapon use in the event of the failure of nuclear deterrence, and the development and proliferation of new missiles technology and hypersonic weapons, for instance, remind of the immense consequences of miscalculation, and also of the further compressed window for decision-making during crisis. While cyber attacks, state or non-state, undermine communication systems so critical in managing crisis. The truth of the matter is, notwithstanding the plethora of regional cooperation processes that ASEAN has given rise over the years, there is still arguably an absence of a crisis management and response capacity that encompass the Indo-Pacific region, and one able to be applied to an emerging crisis in a timely manner. There is, in a sense, a paradox of plenty. Pre-existing processes, while invaluable in providing regular, in most cases annual, opportunities to exchange views on developments in the region, have been less than effective in responding to fast-developing crisis situations in a timely manner. In the absence of such regional crisis response capacity, communication between parties embroiled in a crisis, political, diplomatic, or military to military, so essential to stabilizing the situation and prevent miscalculation, often quickly fall by the wayside. I believe it important for ASEAN to initiate the establishment of an effective region-wide crisis response and management capacity. In this, once again, the East Asia Summit offers promise. A Peace and Security Council of the East Asia Summit, made up of the permanent representatives of the East Asia Summit countries to ASEAN, may be tasked, for instance, to deliberate on emerging crises and given the authority to recommend elevating consideration to the ministerial level and to summit level as the situation requires. Concurrently, efforts to strengthen mill-to-mill relations must be enhanced. The existing 7 areas for practical cooperation among the ADMM+, while invaluable, need to be complemented by the development of a reliable and time-sensitive collective hotline capacity among the participating countries. Both these steps, reaffirmation of peaceful intent and crisis management capacity, are not premised on an overly optimistic notion of a geopolitical rapprochement and reconciliation among the so-called major powers, nor do they rely on a uniform foreign policy outlook by ASEAN member states. Rather, they are anchored on the conviction that although geopolitical shifts and rivalries are here to stay, states in the region share a common interest in promoting strategic stability and avoiding unintended conflict. They also suggest that to remain central and to remain relevant, ASEAN cannot simply exhort others to respect their strategic autonomy. Rather, they must manifest their centrality in concrete policies. Dear friends and colleagues, during its more than 5 decades of existence, obituaries on ASEAN's demise have been written many times over. Yet time and again, ASEAN has proved its resilience, emerging from tests even stronger. Today, it is yet again facing strong headwinds of twin challenge, as a matter of fact. The first is the one that I have expanded on this afternoon, namely on how to respond to complex geopolitical shifts. The second, which I barely touch, though equally significant, is how to respond to the reality of increasing convergence between the internal or national and external or international domains. The reality currently demonstrated on the issue of Myanmar, that developments in its member states, while internal in nature, might have regional repercussions. Whatever the nature of challenges, whether ASEAN wither or prosper, will singularly depend on its own member states. A confident ASEAN, transformative in its outlook, proactively shaping and molding the region's development through the power of its ideas, the power of its initiatives, relentlessly pursued by the resilience and perseverance of its diplomatic efforts, is one that will help ensure an ASEAN that continues to matter. Thank you very much indeed.
Exercise greater agency and influence in light of the escalating challenges around us. examine its, to advance its own understanding of security. An alternative that rejects the might is right approach, but one that looks more broadly at comprehensive security. You've referred to how ASEAN, together with others, need to focus in on our common interests, our shared goals, and those are the ones we need to work for. And if I may, you've also very concretely put forward a call for ASEAN to push for the highest level reaffirmation of peaceful intent. I hope I got the wording right.
Absolutely.
So perhaps I could begin the conversation, and I invite others to come in, by maybe being a little bit of a devil's advocate.
Absolutely. That's what this forum is all about.
That's what the LSE style is, and the Lee Kuan Yew School style. But if I might be devil's advocate, these ideas that ASEAN should take agency and influence, these ideas that we should look for peaceful dispute settlement, that we should repudiate the use of force, those were ideas that were embedded in the Bali Principles, and they've been taken forward by the East Asian Summit. So I suppose a cynic might ask you, we've got swirling new set of challenges. You are inviting us to re-examine and reinvigorate, refresh our underlying principles. How do we know we're going to prevail? Shouldn't we be looking for new tools, new ideas, new principles?
Well, thank you very much. In suggesting some course of action, I am not pretending I have a monopoly of wisdom. Far from it. It is my intention to invoke or provoke those who are in a capacity to make a difference in terms of policymakers, that it's not sufficient to simply express concern and appealing to be left well alone. But to your specific question, I do actually still believe that in terms of the frameworks, in terms of the modalities, ASEAN actually, thanks to the foresight and the anticipation of years past, have all the modalities, the wherewithal. You know, I mean, for instance, the East Asia Summit, and there are colleagues listening and in this room probably as well, who are far more informed than I would be. But I do recall, for instance, upon its inception, there was a very intense debate whether the East Asia Summit should be East Asia in nature, namely restricted to only the ASEAN plus 3 countries, or whether it should be broader than that, including India, Australia, and New Zealand. And I do remember at the time, there was a thought behind it. We felt, yes, there is a risk, including India, including United States and Russia subsequently, there is a real risk that this whole process will become unmanageable. ASEAN will have all these countries with their own problems to contend with, to try to manage. But the alternative would have been all these difficulties would be occurring outside the tent. So at the time, my recollection was the ASEAN perspective was seeing this as a glass half full rather than half empty. And they thought, well, at least we have a fighting chance. If they are in the East Asia Summit, they are there. ASEAN purposefully made the East Asia Summit very much an ASEAN-centered effort. You have to pass the several tests before becoming a participant. The TAC that I mentioned, the test of relevance against the ASEAN community building. So ASEAN was, I mean, from what I knew in the past, was very disciplined in making sure we are in the East Asia Summit as a collective 10. And I remember even the first declaration of the East Asia Summit, we make sure that it doesn't follow alphabetical sequence. It's just all the ASEAN 10 countries mentioned and then the rest. And it's meant to be a leader-led and therefore able to deal with fast developing issues. But somehow, as I was trying to say just now, it is not necessarily the platform that is has shortcomings. Of course, there is always room for improvement. But the state practice there's been an abeyance. There has been a neglect of the very platforms and institutions that ASEAN has created, and we have allowed the processes to become extremely routine. You have an East Asia Summit meeting in November, October of a typical year, but things happen between January and October, November, and it has not been invoked. When, for instance, there was a crisis between India and Pakistan on the border issues, or India and China. I remember the India and China one, the most recent one, almost coincide basically with the convening of the ASEAN Regional Forum. And yet, the solution or the management was found in Moscow, because the two foreign ministers were asked to have a conversation as a three. And I thought, this is like a missed opportunity to exercise relevance. But I think in my personal view, it is better to try and to fail. At least we have a go at it, rather than simply saying, well, this is too difficult and give up. This is why I began in my remarks by addressing. I know there is quite a strong school of thought within ASEAN of that type. So why bother? Why should we get into these things? And that has to be addressed. And this is where I think ASEAN member states must have a real, a good, robust exchanges and honest exchanges. They can't be a la carte regionalism. You only turn up when it suits you. But anyway.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that answer. Now again, I invite the audience here to make your intention known if you do have a question. In the meantime, before I come to you, there's actually a question here that I think is from both the audience and online. Ambassador Ibrahim Yusof from Indonesia. Ambassador, Your Excellency? Yeah, if you would, do you want me to, I'm happy to read out your question, but I wanted to invite you to articulate it yourself, because it relates very much to the kind of building of new tools that we were just talking about. Your Excellency, if you would like to ask your question, and then no worries, I'll come to everyone else in this room.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's really amazing that our former Minister of Foreign Affairs have opportunity to share the view, and I think Pak Marty have already very comprehensive talk about the history of ASEAN, the challenges of the ASEAN at the moment. And I think ASEAN, I fully agree with Pak Marty that we have a modality, and I think the role of the leaders of ASEAN at the moment is how to make the ASEAN is still relevant, especially with the challenges that we facing at the moment, geopolitical shift, and the most important thing also, how we are in ASEAN can answer the challenges about the climate change, about how to elevate our education standard of ASEAN, because at the end, I think the challenges for ASEAN, especially as the very robust and very dynamic region in the world, I think the challenges is how to make the inequality and also the standard of the people can meet with the challenges for the next century. So that's why I think the most important thing that the ASEAN must do, once again, we have a modality, we have a same share, but the problem, how to implementing, to make all the people in ASEAN, we have 600 million people in ASEAN. But once again, the challenges is our education level is not standard, the standard of living is still different, and the capability between the members also is different. And Pa Marty also have already mentioned about the challenges in Myanmar. How the ASEAN can solve the problem of Myanmar, because it will be a track back our vision of ASEAN to more modern and also for more purpose in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is just a comment rather than a question. So,
Still, yeah, but I just wanted to reinforce what the ambassador had said. Essentially, I think it provides a reminder of ASEAN's own efforts, not only in building a political security community, but it's meant to be a three-pillared community, political security, socio-cultural, and economic. I think, again, something that ASEAN, has, in a way, well anticipate what it would take for us to develop as a community. It can't be only economic, it can't only be political security, it must be a comprehensive one. Yeah. And again, I believe we are not lacking in capacities and institutions. In my view, is simply a willingness to actually utilize those capacities.
Yeah, and this comprehensive view is something you've emphasized for a long time, that it's the people who are ultimately going to have to move the organization in this way. Can I turn to Kishore Mahbubani here? And
thank you, Dr. Marty, for that wonderful lecture. It's good to meet is this working? A fellow believer in ASEAN. You spoke about all the challenges we're going to face, and clearly the US-China geopolitical contest is unfortunately definitely going to gain momentum in the next 10 years. That's almost a certainty. At the same time, it's also going to affect us in Southeast Asia. So if you had to talk to if you had a meeting with, let's say, the leaders in the United States and China, and try to persuade them, just as we have a Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, and we want to create a Southeast Asian geopolitical contest-free zone here, how would you try and persuade the US and China to say, if you want to carry on with the contest, carry on, can you leave Southeast Asia aside?
Well, yes, I mean, that's quite a task there, Kishore. I mean, in terms of the obvious, I tried to avoid just now the temptation to simply describe what is now happening before us, or even at best analyzing what are the dynamics, what are the motivations, why we are where we are, but focus on how to respond. And I mean, later on, tomorrow morning our time and evening, Monday evening in United States, I'm informed that there will be the what they call it, the communication between the two leaders of United States and China. This is the kind of key junctures I would have thought either before. I mean, this idea of having a summit has been known for some time now, the virtual summit. It would have been quite critical, in my view, if ASEAN wants to be relevant, to interject beforehand and to publicly, not shy away in imploring the two leaders, please, we not to simply say, don't make us choose between you, but you must demonstrate your capacity to responsibility to maintain the region's peace. We recognize you have problems and differences between the two of you, but we expect the two of you to demonstrate, as so-called major powers, you have to behave responsibly. And having a personal commitment, if I was thinking about the meeting tomorrow, having the two leaders express personal commitment that they are personally in charge of the management of the two countries' relations, that would be a huge decompressing impact. Everyone will feel slightly better to know that these two leaders have spoken and they're basically saying, we get it, we get it, none of you wants any conflict to break out, we will try our best to temper, to bring down the likelihood of accidental conflict. But this is what I meant, key junctures. Just a few years ago now, when we had the Korean dynamics, during the Korean Peninsula dynamics being disrupted by President Trump's different approaches to the situation. And Singapore actually became host to the leaders meeting, and Vietnam became host. I mean, those are not accidental, right? I mean, it must represent, once again, how Southeast Asia, not ASEAN necessarily, has the confidence and the trust of the major parties. But did ASEAN try to lock in that fragile evidence of changing dynamics on the Korean Peninsula, or were we simply giving a running commentary as it was happening? And so that's why on this U.S.-China dynamic, I wish, I'm just a wishful thinking here, ASEAN makes a more timely interjection and call these leaders up to task, to say, look, it's not sufficient for us to simply tell them, don't force us to choose. We have to tell them what we want. And this is what I see at the moment is we are seeking autonomy, we are seeking strategic autonomy and hoping that this will somehow proliferate and blossom into great things. But the strategic autonomy absence actual utilization will simply dissipate, in my view. And what I'm suggesting just now I'm not saying it is what should be pursued, but I'm just trying to provoke policymakers to can we think of something more concrete than simply, that's what it is.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think sometimes when we think about the role of ASEAN or whoever else in mediating in these conversations, our mind naturally gravitates to the big issues that go bang, whether it's nuclear proliferation or military conflict. But the answer you've given, Pak Marty, is also more full spectrum. The US-China tensions have been disruptive of all manner of economic life, not just military conflict, technological progress, academic scholarship, trade relations, global supply chains, and all this are hugely affecting ASEAN. That ASEAN needs to get in there and make its views sort of known, I think is critical, and you've given us some insight onto why we must further do that. Can I turn to Melly, I think? I can't quite see for sure because everyone's got masks on, but if you could. Thank you.
Yes, I can.
You've always said, I think, in your speeches and most recently, that ASEAN has lost the script and that ASEAN, from your speech just now, appears to be no longer fit for purpose. So you've called on a very ambitious call to basically, ASEAN get its act together, and one of that is get the commitment of the East Asian Summit countries to agree to perhaps consider a treaty for the East Asia Summit. Now, perhaps in 2011, at the zenith of ASEAN, that would have really made resonance. But a decade later, now we have competing structures in the region. You have Quad, and increasingly you have, of course, another arrangement, which has in May affected, right, this whole thrust of ASEAN's call for a nuclear-free ASEAN. I'm talking about the AUKUS. So two major arrangements that, in a way, that also have members of the East Asia Summit. So how do you then, if you were now to advise the Indonesian chair in 2023, right, how do you push this idea? Because these are real challenges to ASEAN centrality. And ASEAN really, is in a very different position now than it was perhaps 10 or 5 years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I wouldn't want to suggest as if there has to be a monolithic, when we say ASEAN centrality, it means we can live side by side with other processes. I think ASEAN should never pretend that it can be the provider for all and therefore be jealous of different processes. I think that would be what would be making life far too difficult for ASEAN to try to keep the lead on other processes and ensure that everything has to go through the ASEAN modality. In some ways, so that's in other words, the so-called minilateralism is something that is in a way inevitable. There will be processes outside ASEAN-led, ASEAN-initiated. But what is changing now, to your question, I think I get the sense that whereas in the past ASEAN-initiated processes is there, central, and there are other minilaterals out there, processes, increasingly is becoming more multi-faceted, multi-platform. The AUKUS and the Quad that you mentioned before. I mean, like for instance, the Quad, actually, until the recent reinvigoration, ASEAN managed to put a lid on that by empowering the East Asia Summit. Because I remember in trying to entice and push the United States to join together with Russia concurrently, certainly insofar as Indonesia was concerned, as I was motivated to make sure that this Quad thing doesn't get more momentum. But if the East Asia Summit itself becomes quite routine forum where leaders, instead of having a real informal retreat and exchanging ideas and thoughts and simply deliver remarks and have outcome already prepared by officials months before, weeks before, then there is an unfelt need. There is a need that's not met. And therefore, these things go elsewhere. And we have now the AUKUS, they have the Quad. We haven't even mentioned the economic domain, which of course that you're a professor, that you are far more informed than I would be. The RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is ASEAN-led, initially at least, as I remember it, Indonesia introduced it in 2011 with the hope that this will provide, again, an ASEAN-led ASEAN 10, but then we have the TPP, and now we miss India not joining RCEP. Instead, we have China wanting to join the TPP. So it is a challenge. I think we shouldn't be distracted by the proliferation of other processes, but we should focus on ASEAN's own capacity to deliver on what it promises to. If it does what it's supposed to do, then I think the rest becomes naturally less relevant. So we don't have to sort of like speak ill of this organization or that organization. Just focus with what we have and see. Because if you think about it, prior to ASEAN, our region was similarly dissected by all kind of pacts and alliances and defense arrangement, but none of them were sustained in the end because it didn't have the quality of regional ownership. But it reminds, in my view, as I said in the past before, the revitalization of the Quad, the promulgation of the AUKUS is a direct consequence of ASEAN's dithering. If we dither and we have self-doubts, then others will, do what they must. Yeah.
Can I follow up? I'm going to come next to this this gentleman here, but I wanted to follow up on this conversation in terms of, because you've made reference to the past, what ASEAN did, the dithering that you referred to, and what ASEAN must do going forwards. There's actually a question here from a different Indonesian ambassador, Ibrahim Yusuf. And his question relates to what you were just saying. Is it possible for us to look back on, say, the US-Soviet agreements during the Cold War and how ASEAN sought to navigate that landscape? Can we use that as a possible template for or what are the lessons we learned from that era that we should not repeat the mistakes of as we navigate going forwards with, AUKUS showing up so prominently in this region, China's increasing musculature? Are there lessons from that era that we should be mindful of going forwards?
Well, there are colleagues here who can, I'm sure, speak far more with greater thoughtfulness and than I could. But my first thought is that obviously there is no one size fits all, right? Every situation would be unique to its time, but still lessons can be drawn. One lesson I'm drawing from US-Soviet Union, the Cold War era, would be how, notwithstanding the depth and the severity of the tensions, there were still attempts at stabilizing the relationship. There were agreements and principles and norms to stabilize the two countries' relations, to have a predictability of behavior. In the nuclear field, that's the most obvious, which is absent at the moment here in this part of the world. Look at on nuclear, the risk of nuclear proliferation in our part of the world, in this part of the world. There is not even, for instance, a US, China, Russia trilateral process on this type of issue. But having said that, I think it's also important. One lessons learned that I would like to draw from US-Soviet Union would be what kind of steps that can be taken to stabilize even the deepest of animosity. But at the same time, I think it's not a like with like, because US-Soviet Union, obviously, while it was political, ideological, and security, contrasts sharply with US and China now, which is all of the above, plus many other facets, and you can, the notion of decoupling, for instance, the economic decoupling between US and China would literally force even commercial economic decision based on strategic considerations as well. So yes, it's important. There are lessons to be drawn in terms of stabilizing strategic rivalry. But at the same time, there are differences in terms of the manifestation of the competition, and not least of all, and this is the point that I hope all of us in this region can I'm sure, appreciate. It is not only US-China. At least US-China is probably it's the known unknown, right? To paraphrase someone. Whereas you have all the other dynamics that are, at the risk of oversimplification, cited: India, China, Russia, the Northeast Asia dynamics. All of them are filled with tensions and uncertainty. And that's why I think ASEAN's efforts must, in my view, must be to rise above all these dynamics of the actual specific problems, to say, look, the problems are tremendously, extremely difficult, but at least let's agree that we are going to manage, not even solve, to manage these problems diplomatically. And that's all we are asking, not pretending that we will solve them. or at least don't do no harm. If the current generation of whoever is not able to solve them, but at least we should manage them. That's my idea.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, the gentleman here, this might have to be the last question given the time, but sir, please.
Hi, Pak Marty. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts. My name is Dennis. I'm the founder of a social enterprise here in Singapore called NewYork.sg. My question is on Indonesia's foreign policy. How do you think the competing domestic institutions and forces within Indonesia will have an impact on your country's foreign policy and outlook? I mean, you have the military, which in recent days was reported that the Indonesian Navy detained commercial shipping crews passing through your waters until they paid some fees, and where the recipient of those fees couldn't be independently verified. You have multi-party civilian politics, you have the cleric class, the religious class, and more recently a technology class that is contributing significantly to your economy, and where some of the tech entrepreneurs are growing in influence and getting involved in politics, among many other domestic forces. Can you share your observation of these various forces and how they interact and compete with each other? And how do you see Indonesia's foreign policy and outlook evolving as a result? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I won't be able to comment on some of the specific issues that you cited for lack of more comprehensive information. But your question still is a pertinent one, namely the nexus, the convergence or divergence between domestic dynamic and how it impacts on a country's foreign policy orientations and priorities, so to speak. And in this connection, Indonesia is not unique in the sense that all countries are having to manage these two levels, or these two domains, the internal and external. But in Indonesia's case, it has been, I know that some of us recently are fond of saying that the situation nowadays is unique. The domestic political setting is especially vibrant, and this impact on our foreign policy orientation, foreign policy emphasis. But actually, if I'm not as a student of history would recall that Indonesia's internal domestic setting there's always been dynamic that has to be manifested and managed externally. I give a case in point. When Bung Hatta promulgated the idea of independent and active foreign policy in 1948, to ask the question, is there no other choice between either being pro-US or pro-Russia? To my knowledge, he wasn't simply addressing an external dynamic, but also internal, because within Indonesia at the time, there were some who wanted to be closer to Soviet Union, others wanted to be closer to the United States, and therefore, at a stroke, he managed to put that to rest, to say, look, Indonesia doesn't have to choose between these two camps. We can have our own independent and active foreign policy, bebas and active. And all throughout, that has been a challenge for the chief architect of Indonesian foreign policy, how to make sure that the foreign policy addresses the internal domestic expectation, but at the same time is relevant to the external domain. I don't know. I don't want to give any impressions of recent developments, but sometimes the notion of domesticated foreign policy becomes quite strong, in the sense that many countries nowadays look at foreign policy issues from their domestic prism, and impacting on their foreign policy orientation. And in this connection, the traditional foreign policy machinery, institutions, the foreign ministries, etc., becomes a very important first among equal in making sure that the domestic setting understands what are the international situations. But specifically, for instance, on the U.S.-China dynamic, once again, how decisions taken as a commercial decision may have an impact on geopolitical risks Indonesia may discover subsequently. And therefore, decisions that may on paper be pure transactional, mercantilist, commercial decision must somehow be imbued by, at the same time, with geopolitical consideration. But it's easier said than done. It is a condition that all of us, I mean, all decision makers must try to manage. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, but I'm going to have one more last question. So, Lynn, I will let you have the last question.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you so much, Dr. Marty Natalegawa. You mentioned earlier the need for the reaffirmation of peaceful intent from all parties. I was wondering about the utility of such affirmation of peaceful intent in the face of creeping grey zone encroachments, for example, in the South China Sea, where you've seen one major power in the region encroaching upon the exclusive economic zones of countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. So would these affirmations of peaceful intent be, in a sense, mere words? And if we listen to them, would we merely be burying our heads in the sand?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, perfectly understandable and question and sentiment, because I'm sure back in 1976, barely a decade after ASEAN was formed, when relations between ASEAN member states were still filled with tensions and mistrust, I'm sure a similar type of question would have been asked. What's the point of having such a commitment when it's simply a declaratory statement of intent? But the truth of the matter is that subsequent developments, it has had a powerful impact in actually changing the dynamic, changing the mindset. Yes, we have many a problem, but we have to find a common solution. This is where I think that's why a couple, on the South China Sea, you are quite correct. I remember as a young official beginning the process with my bosses then, the South China Sea dialogue process, the so-called workshop on the South China Sea. And at the time, the notion of having an ASEAN developing a declaration, a code of conduct on the South China Sea was seen as being too an abstract an effort. But it proved to be prescient, it proved to be anticipatory, that we need a modality for this kind of management of a risk of a conflict situation. That's why I think while the commitment, principled commitment has already been made to some extent, it is important to have this solidified by a treaty-level commitment by the countries concerned. Otherwise, it will. But even a political declaration, perfection can be the enemy of the good. We want to have the perfect document, very clear. Is this a code of behavior? Is this a treaty? Is this legally binding, etc.? Diplomats and lawyers can go endlessly going through this type of text. But I think sometimes there is a power, an appeal to something that seems to be spontaneous. Have a group of leaders of the East Asia Summit, in their own words, simply say, look, we have huge problems between us, but let's agree not to make things worse. I think it doesn't need a beautiful legal text. All it needs are the leaders willing to sit in one room and say so. And I have a strong feeling it will filter down. That's why I was a little bit, and frank, obviously I'm not privy to what was the consideration going back and forth, but I'm a little bit perplexed given where we are today with ASEAN, for instance, for the most recent summit, why there was no attempt, or well, there may have been an attempt, but there was no in-person summit meeting. I thought it would be rather powerful and rather important, especially given where we are. But no, in my view, having something that is a declaration of intent, while not ideal, is still important, given the time, that the situation where we are today, where in the absence, if we are to wait for the perfect document, commitment, then it may be too late. That's the.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to call this event to an end. There are so many more questions that have come in on the document, on the online document, many of which we've worked into the conversation and that you've touched on. But at the same time, it is clear, as you've said, that we spend a lot of time thinking about US-China relations and where we place there. But even if the world were bipolar, which we're not convinced it is, the challenges are not just bipolar, they're everywhere. And ASEAN needs to get stuck in. You have, in your answers, also provided us tantalizing looks at your thinking on these broader issues. I think given that combination, we must have you back for some longer, more extended conversation. Thank you. But calling this to an end, Marty, I want to thank you so much for doing this. You've given us a wonderful lecture. You've engaged us in such a wonderful conversation. And I have to say, you've spoken about such serious, consequential things with such gentleness, humility, and thoughtfulness. It actually gives us hope that we will be able to get through this. So I want to thank you very much for this. Thank you.
Thank you.